I'm Kat Mueller. I'm the educator for adult programs here at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, and we really appreciate you joining us this evening. This program is the final talk in our series connected to the exhibition Discriminating Thieves, Nazi-Looted Art and Restitution. Earlier talks this year discussed Nazi art looting during World War II and the recovery of stolen art by the Allies, as well as how today's conflicts affect cultural heritage around the world and the role of museums in the development of the Monuments Men. Tonight's talk, entitled Safe Haven, the Nelson-Atkins and the Protection of Art During World War II, is presented by MacKenzie Mallon, provenance specialist here at the Nelson-Atkins, and further explains the museum ties to the Monuments Men and our role as a repository for art evacuated from the East and West Coasts. As provenance specialist, MacKenzie works alongside the curatorial departments to research the provenance, or ownership history, of the museum collection. She received her MA in art history from the University of Missouri at Columbia, and her primary research interest is Nazi-era provenance and the art market during World War II. She curated the 2014 exhibition, Braving Shells for Art, The Monuments Men of the Nelson-Atkins, and this year's Discriminating Thieves, Nazi-Looted Art and Restitution. Her most recent publication is A Refuge from War, the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art and the Evacuation of Art to the Midwest during World War II, seen in the February 2016 issue of the Getty Research Journal. In addition to her research on the Nelson-Atkins collection, MacKenzie is a frequent speaker and moderator at provenance research-related programs in both the US and Europe. Now, without further delay, please help me welcome MacKenzie.
Thanks, Kat, so much for that introduction, and apologies again for the slight delay. A second apology for the fact that I've got some kind of throat coffee thing going on, and so if I'm sipping on the water all night long, you know why, but hopefully I can keep it down and we can move quickly. So it is my pleasure to be here tonight to speak with you all about the history of the Nelson-Atkins during World War II. This talk is held in conjunction with the exhibition Discriminating Thieves, Nazi-Looted Art and Restitution, which is on view currently upstairs in Gallery P10. The exhibition brings together 4 works of art from the Nelson-Atkins collection that share a history of having been looted by the Nazis during World War II, recovered and restituted at the end of the war, and subsequently acquired legally by the Nelson-Atkins. The exhibition is on view through January 26th of 2020, so I hope if you haven't yet had the opportunity that you'll get up there soon and take a look through it. It's really, it's small, but it's really powerful. And the exhibition is generously funded by Mr. Neil Carbank and the Neil D. Carbank Foundation. So tonight we're going to take a look at how the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art played a pivotal role in the safeguarding of art and cultural heritage during World War II. The museum and its staff contributed to what was really a global preservation effort, both on the home front here in Kansas City and abroad in the war zones of both Europe and Asia. And the last point, they participated most significantly as members of the group that today we know as the Monuments Men. Let's take a moment to consider some background, and if you attended my talk in January on Nazi art looting, I'm hoping that this will be more of a brief refresher rather than a repetition. World War II posed a danger to art and cultural heritage in a variety of ways, but the 2 most significant included outright theft and destruction of art by the Nazis and obliteration of art and cultural heritage as the result of military action by both sides. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi forces began stealing art in 1933, immediately following Hitler's appointment as German Chancellor. The Nazis looted art on a scale and with a systematic intent that was really never before seen in history, ultimately stealing more than 5 million works of art from throughout the continent of Europe. Most of these works were confiscated from museums and private collectors for future inclusion in German museums and to pad the vast private collections of the highest-ranking Nazi officials. Jewish collections were particularly targeted as the result of Nazi laws that denied Jews the right to own property. In the US and other Allied countries, although it was known that the Nazis were stealing art, the extent of their looting was not fully understood at the time that the US entered the war. There was, however, a deep concern for the inherent threat to art and cultural heritage as a result of military operations. The bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, elevated this concern, particularly among members of the arts community. They began to advocate for art professionals to work alongside the military, assessing the risk to cultural heritage and art treasures in forward areas, and to develop plans for their protection. This advocacy led to the creation of a committee called the American Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Artistic and Historic Monuments in War Areas, which is currently more briefly considered usually by its shorter name, the Roberts Commission, which is for its chair, Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts. This civilian commission was tasked with promoting the preservation of cultural property within the military theater, provided that this mission did not interfere with official military operations. One of the first tasks that the Roberts Commission undertook was to recommend officers for a newly formed section of the U.S. Army called the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Section, or the MFA&A. Over the next 3 years, over 350 men and women from 14 nations would serve as monuments officers. They were charged with preserving cultural heritage, historic buildings, and works of art in areas that were affected by the war. Some of these officers were draftees, and many of them were reassigned to the monuments section from other areas of service, and other officers were volunteers. Most of them had a background in the arts, and they included art museum directors, curators, conservators. There were historians and even dancers. 6 monuments men were affiliated with the Nelson-Atkins at some point in their lives. This is really an exceptionally large number for a single institution, and I think that that speaks to the reputation of the Nelson-Atkins and its staff. These 6 monuments men were Paul Gardner, Patrick Kelleher, James A. Reeds, Otto Whitman Jr., Lawrence Sickman, and Langdon Warner. So let's take a brief moment with each of them and consider how they were specifically, how they contributed to the preservation of art and cultural heritage during World War II. So around a dozen monuments officers were assigned to join the Allied invasion of Italy in the fall of 1943. One of them was the first director of the Nelson-Atkins, named Paul Gardner. We're very fortunate to have Gardner's personal accounts of his experiences in the form of letters that he sent back to the staff here at the Nelson-Atkins. These letters are extremely valuable sources for understanding what it was like to serve as a monuments officer. Many of them are preserved today in the museum's archive, and through them we can piece together a fairly accurate understanding of Gardner's work as a monuments man. In September of 1943, Gardner accompanied the Allied troops as they landed on the Italian mainland. Now, a few weeks later, once the fighting had moved northward, Gardner was assigned to direct the Army's monuments efforts in and around the area of Naples, which I've indicated on the map by the red arrow. He had very little time to become acclimated to his new role. Not long after he arrived in Naples, he was told that the Allies had found several crates of paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects in a damaged castle in the Italian town of Mignano. Now, Gardner recognized this location as the home of Benjamin Seymour Guinness. He was a member of the Guinness beer family from Ireland who had married an Italian countess and moved most of his art collection to this castle in Mignano. At this point, the town of Mignano, which I've marked with a red X on the map, it was being shelled by the Germans during what would later become known as the Battle of Mignano Gap. This was a precursor to the lengthy and devastating Battle of Monte Cassino, which took place just 17 miles north of Mignano. Now, although the monuments officers generally did not work at the front, they were often very close behind the fighting, and it wasn't unusual for their efforts to take them into forward areas. So in this instance, that's exactly what happened with Gardner. Despite the active shelling in the area, he was determined to reach the Guinness Castle and evacuate the art if he could. On these next few slides, you're going to see photographs of Mignano and the Guinness Castle immediately following the battle. These images were taken by the monuments officers on site and today are housed in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. As far as I know, this is the first time that they've been seen outside the archives since the war. Although the photographer is not recorded in this instance, I think that it's very likely that these photographs were taken by Paul Gardner. He often served as the official photographer for the monuments officers in this area. He was certainly there on site at the time that these images were taken, and he doesn't actually appear in any of the photographs. But regardless of who the photographer was, they really do show exactly what Gardner was dealing with when he entered Mignano. Now, upon approaching the town, Gardner encountered shell fire from a neighboring hillside. And by his own account, he met an American military policeman at the base of the hill on which the town and the castle stood. The MP advised him to turn back, but Gardner was very persistent, and he described this experience in a letter. Quote, "Soon we could hear the whistle of the shells as they went over our heads, but the fine arts are never daunted, so we left the truck, crawling hand over foot over the great tree trunks and branches, in which we heard later there were booby traps." End quote. In the photo on the left, which was taken from within the footprint of the castle on the top of the hill, you can make out the distant valley at the top. Let me see if I can figure out this. Yeah, you can really make out the distant valley at the top of the image, and it gives you a sense of the height of the hill that Gardner and the military policeman had to climb to get into the town. When they arrived, they discovered that one wall of the castle had totally collapsed as a result of the bombing, and you can see that in the photograph on the right. But Gardner considered that enough of the castle still stood to allow him to go inside. And when he did, he found several crates of paintings, sculptures, and tapestries. In that same letter, he described what he found. Quote, "But someone had been there before us. The custodian told us that experienced German officer experts had systematically broken open all the bales and boxes and had taken the cream of the collection. The Germans have proven all along to be discriminating thieves." End quote. Indeed, this is the source of the Discriminating Thieves exhibition's title. Here are just a few more photographs of the castle, the monuments officers digging through the rubble of the Guinness Castle in Mignano. You can see on the right, they've recovered an armchair, which looks a little worse for wear. And then in this last series of images, on the left, you can see a shot of the damaged castle from a wider angle. And on the right, for comparison, you can see the restored castle as it appears today. Now, despite the drama and the excitement of his first adventure as a monuments officer, The majority of Gardner's work in Italy involved finding ways to protect what remained of the historic buildings, museums, and libraries that had been damaged in the fighting, and to assist the Italian arts community with restoration and conservation needs. They would shore up crumbling walls, put up temporary roofs over bombed-out structures, and suggest means of conservation for damaged artworks. Military needs usually eclipsed the needs of the monuments officers, and so Gardner and his fellow officers usually had to scrounge for the supplies that they might need to pack up recovered artworks or transportation in order to transport art from one place to another. And they often had to get manpower from the Italians themselves, as we saw in the previous images of the castle. Like most monuments officers, Gardner spent most of his time on the move. In December of 1944, for example, he and several other monuments officers spent 10 days traveling around central Italy, assessing the damage to a number of different towns and documenting what they found there. I tried to recreate his trip on this map using Google. There's a certain margin of error because he tells us what towns they visited and in what order, but he doesn't say exactly the route that they took. But it does give you an idea of the amount of area that they covered in a relatively short period of time, only 10 days to go through all of this. Although the Nazis did loot some art from Italian collections, the experience of the monuments officers in Italy was, for the most part, focused on assessing bomb damage. Now, farther north, as the war in Europe neared its conclusion and Allied forces advanced further into Austria and Germany, the experiences of the monuments officers working in Northern Europe were very different. They began receiving messages from Allied troops near the front who were uncovering these massive caches of looted art that the Nazis had hidden away in castles and salt mines and other protected locations. And as these advancing troops continued to uncover these hideaways, they would contact the monuments officers to coordinate the removal of all this art that they'd found. Similar to the experiences of the officers in Italy, monuments men in Northern Europe also had to scrounge for supplies and transportation and manpower. And following the German surrender, the monuments men set up 4 collecting points within Germany to help them more efficiently catalog all of these works of art that they were finding and to document everything. Within these collecting points, monuments officers, often again working alongside members of the local arts communities, they would photograph and record and research the artworks that they had found in an attempt to determine the rightful owners so that then they could hopefully be restituted. The 2 largest collecting points were at Munich, which was housed in the former Nazi Party headquarters there, and Wiesbaden, housed in the former headquarters of the German Luftwaffe. One of the monuments officers assigned to Wiesbaden was Patrick Kelleher, who later served as the Nelson-Atkins first curator of European art. Now, as the head of the Greater Hesse division of the MFA&A, Kelleher worked primarily to recover the art objects that had been removed from the German national museums for safekeeping. In this capacity, he recovered some of the most famous artworks in the world, including the bust of Nefertiti from Berlin. In November of 1945, Kelleher was one of 24 monuments officers to protest a U.S. Army plan to send a number of Germany's greatest artistic treasures to the U.S. for a multi-year traveling exhibition. This exhibition was being organized without a timeline for the objects returned to Germany and against the wishes of the post-war German leaders. And Kelleher and the other monuments officers protesting this argued that this removal of Germany's art without their consent was tantamount to the Nazis' art looting campaign. However, their protests were unsuccessful, and the exhibition was authorized by President Harry Truman. It visited 13 different cities in the US. Kansas City was not one of them, but it was wildly popular, as you can see in the photo on the left of school children lined up literally as far as the eye can see to get into the Toledo Museum of Art. And on the right, you see some of the 1 million visitors to the National Gallery of Art venue in DC. Following the war, Kelleher served as a curator at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and at the Albright Knox Art Gallery before joining the Nelson-Atkins as the first curator of European art. His tenure here was from 1954 to 1959. And during his time in Kansas City, he was responsible for the acquisition of the museum's, of some of the museum's most recognizable works of European art, including the Petrus Christus, Madonna and Child in an Interior, and Claude Monet's Water Lilies. Kelleher wasn't the only Nelson-Atkins monuments man who worked in Wiesbaden. James A. Reeds was born in Kansas City and initially had served in France. But at the end of the war, he became chief clerk at the US headquarters for the European forces. And during his time there, he responded to incoming messages from Allied troops reporting that they had recovered or secured artworks and monuments that they'd found in these large stashes of Nazi loot. Reeds married Austrian Hetty Neumann, whom he had met while she was working at the Allied Military Government Censorship Office, and the couple later returned to Kansas City. Reeds worked as a linguistic professor at UMKC until his retirement in 1990. He served here at the Nelson-Atkins as a docent for a number of years and was present at the White House in 2007 when President George Bush presented the National Medal of the Humanities to the surviving monuments officers. Reeds passed away in 2012, but his wife Hetty, his daughter-in-law Karen, his granddaughter, and his brand new great-grandson came to the Nelson-Atkins in 2014 to see the display that we put up in the block lobby on the Monuments Men. And it was a really wonderful experience to get to talk to them about Jim's experiences as a monuments man. Otto Whitman Jr. was the first curator of prints here at the Nelson-Atkins, and he served in that capacity from 1933 to 1937. During World War II, Whitman's first job was interviewing draftees, but towards the end of the war, he put those interrogation skills to use with the Art Looting and Investigation Unit of the Office of Strategic Services. Now, the OSS is the precursor to today's CIA. His most famous interview was with Hans Wendland, a German art dealer who was instrumental in some of the largest Nazi art looting transactions during the war. In the last 2 decades, the story of the monuments officers has become more widely known, primarily through a number of books and films that have focused on the heroic efforts of the monuments men. And while these all haven't been entirely accurate, they have been instrumental in drawing attention to the story of the monuments men in Europe. But as we know, World War II was a global conflict, and European culture was not the only culture under fire. In Asia, many historically significant buildings and monuments were suffering damage as a result of military action, and the Allies sent monuments officers to these areas as well. One of the most significant was Lawrence Sickman. Sickman had studied Chinese art at Harvard and spent several years in China in the early 1930s acquiring works of art on behalf of the Nelson-Atkins. He became the museum's first curator of Asian art in 1935. Now, after the beginning of the war, Sickman volunteered for the Army Air Force, and he spent much of the war utilizing his Chinese language skills as a member of the intelligence service. He served in the US, in the UK, in India, and finally, in April of 1944, he was posted to the 14th Air Force stationed at Kunming, China. His primary duties involved processing intelligence on enemy combat forces, especially anti-aircraft capabilities. And he prepared maps and charts that would assist combat units in targeting enemy positions. This fun drawing, which was given to Sickman by a friend in the intelligence service, it really shows, I think, how difficult Sickman's job must have been trying to get some of this intelligence information out of his fellow officers. It wasn't always an easy job, and he was behind a desk a lot of the time. But there is one story that Sickman told from a time that he did get to get out from behind that desk, and that story has become quite famous here at the museum. In September of 1945, just days after the surrender of the Japanese, it was decided that members of Sickman's intelligence group should visit the headquarters of the Japanese command in Beijing in order to assess the effects of Allied air operations in that area. Now, our archivist here at the Nelson-Atkins, Tara Laver, and I are currently trying to work to figure out as much as we can about what happened on this mission, exactly where they went, and whether or not this series of photographs, which come from a large binder of photographs that live in the archives here at the museum, whether or not they definitively show, or whether or not they were taken by Sickman on this particular mission. According to Sickman, this mission, immediately after the Japanese surrender, the personnel consisted of his chief intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Williams, who I think appears in the center of the photograph on the left. The group also included the crew of a B-25 in which they flew, and we think that is the plane on the right. It included a Japanese interpreter, and then there was Sickman, who had just been promoted to major. He, I think, best describes this mission in his own words in a letter that he sent to Nelson-Atkins trustee J.C. Nichols. Quote, "The trip was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Everywhere we went, the Japanese were as yet still armed and had not yet made formal surrender. At several places, we were the first representatives of the Allied forces to land on the fields since the beginning of the war. You can well imagine that we were not always calm and assured. We had no information about any of the fields we were landing on, save the one at Peking. There was no radio contact, and we were in every sense of the word on our own. But we were magnificently treated by the Japanese everywhere we went. They furnished us quarters in the best hotels, motor cars, and the first good scotch I've had since leaving Kansas City. When we arrived back at the base, the entire nose of the airplane was full of samurai swords surrendered to us by the Japanese officers." A few weeks after this incredible experience, in November of 1945, Sickman was transferred out of the Air Force Intelligence Service and to the Monuments section of the Army, and then he began his work as a monuments man in Asia. He was headquartered at General MacArthur's HQ in Tokyo, and he spent most of the next year traveling around China, Japan, and Korea, inspecting museums and cultural sites, documenting damage, and supporting the rebuilding effort. He was also instrumental in the restitution to China of a number of artistic, historic, and literary material that had been taken out of that country by the Japanese. The sixth and final monuments man that was affiliated with the Nelson-Atkins was Langdon Warner. Warner had served as Sickman's mentor at Harvard, and he also served as an advisor on Asian art to the Nelson-Atkins in the very earliest years of the museum. Immediately following Pearl Harbor, Warner wrote to Sickman and wrote, these were really very impatient letters. He was imploring Sickman, strongly encouraging him to volunteer for the war effort and put his unique abilities to use. He also bemoaned the fact that his age, Warner was 60 at the time, would probably keep him out of active service. But he did get a chance to contribute to the war effort himself. In DC, he served as a special consultant to the Roberts Commission, and he taught Japanese and Japanese culture to the civil affairs officers. In March of 1946, he was able to join Sickman in Tokyo, where he worked as an expert consultant to the MFA&A for about 5 months. Now let's turn away from the war on foreign soil and consider efforts made here at home to protect art in the United States. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the threat to cities like San Francisco and Seattle from bombing by the Japanese, and New York and Washington, D.C. from bombing by the Germans was considered very real and possibly even imminent. Museums and private collectors on both the East and the West Coast feared for the safety of their collections in the case of invasion. Some of them took in-house precautions to protect from the impact of shell blasts. They would pack up sandbags in the galleries. Rumor has it that the Museum of Modern Art in New York deinstalled their entire collection and moved it to the basement every night. I haven't been able to verify that, though. But many museums and private collections decided that their best option was simply to transport their objects away from the cities and from military targets. The National Gallery of Art, for example, sent its most important works to the Biltmore Mansion near Asheville, North Carolina. And keep in mind that the National Gallery at this point hadn't even been open 2 years. A number of these museums and private collectors recognized the benefit of moving their works of art to the Midwest. Bombing raids were extremely unlikely this far inland, and the recent boom in the development of Midwestern museums offered ideal locations to house refugee art. The Indianapolis Museum of Art, the Colorado Springs Art Center, the St. Louis Art Museum, and the Joslin Art Memorial in Omaha all housed works of art from coastal collections. But the Nelson-Atkins was uniquely suited to serve as a safe haven for all of this evacuated art. And this museum housed 150 works from a dozen different collections, including some of the most important ones in the country. There were several reasons why museums and collectors would choose to send their artworks to Kansas City. The primary one we already mentioned, that we're so far inland, bombing raids are very unlikely. But Kansas City was also a major railroad hub, which allowed for easy transport into and out of the city. This was a big deal in a period when gasoline and rubber rationing made shipping art by truck prohibitively expensive. In 1940, approximately 60,000 trains went through Kansas City's Union Station, which is, of course, only 3.5 miles from the Nelson-Atkins. The timing of the war in relation to the museum's evolution also contributed to its ability to serve as a sanctuary for evacuated art. In the 8 years between the opening of the Nelson-Atkins in 1933 and the entry of the U.S. into the war in 1941, the museum had acquired over 8,000 works of art. Now, clearly, this is rapid growth. However, at the time, this 1933 building was so large that the whole west wing was not yet needed as gallery space and thus was not yet finished. It was, however, outfitted with climate control systems, which were considered state-of-the-art at the time. And so all of that space could be used as storage areas. And that's right here on this side. Here's Roselle. It's the galleries that surrounded Roselle Court. The museum's reputation also contributed to its consideration as a safe haven for art. The initial formation of the museum during the Great Depression, when all the other art institutions in the U.S. were cutting back, really gave the Nelson-Atkins an advantage in terms of not only exceptional art purchases, but also the acquisition of key personnel. Director Paul Gardner, curator of Asian art Lawrence Sickman, and the staff serving alongside them were highly respected members of the arts community. And this, of course, led to Gardner and Sickman's recruitment as monuments men. Museums and collectors seeking a safe place to house their art for the duration could have confidence that the qualified staff here at the museum would care for their art just as well as they care for the Nelson-Atkins collections. Thus, the museum received dozens of inquiries from museums and private collectors on both the east and west coasts of the US and from Europe. It all started in November of 1939. This is 2 years before Pearl Harbor. When Amsterdam art dealer D.A. Hogendijk, who was acting on behalf of his client, the Dutch collector David Birnbaum, contacted the Nelson-Atkins. 8 paintings from Birnbaum's collection arrived in Kansas City in July of 1940. They included a Rembrandt, head of an old man in a cap, and a Rubens, portrait of Susanna Forment. Birnbaum agreed to allow the paintings to be put on display in the galleries rather than to just have them sit languishing in storage. But the only stipulation was that they be displayed anonymously. So Gardner put them in a gallery by themselves, and although they were to be displayed anonymously, it didn't mean that they couldn't be advertised. And advertised they were. This full-page spread on the front page of this Star was a big spread, and the Star really seemed to take pride in the new role that their hometown museum was taking. The brief text on the upper left, part of it reads, quote, "The paintings are now owned by a European who never saw the Nelson Gallery. He asked a dealer to find a secure refuge for them in the United States where they would have expert care. The dealer selected the Kansas City Gallery. His only stipulation was that his name should not be mentioned, presumably for fear that friends or relatives under German control might be penalized. In such devious ways are the finest achievements of the human race saved from the fury of the Blitzkrieg." In December of 1941, immediately following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the number of requests to have the Nelson-Atkins store evacuated art really started to snowball. And at the end of that month, New York financier Robert Lehman contacted the museum looking for a place to store part of his collection of early Renaissance panel paintings. Now today you can see most of Lehman's collection on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The request by Lehman was received by Paul Gardner, who wouldn't actually leave the museum to serve as a monuments man in Italy for another few months. And Gardner was really excited about the Lehman loans. At this point, the Nelson-Atkins collection didn't include a lot of examples from this period, and they were really popular with the public. A little too popular, as it turns out. Public interest was so great that the identity of Lehman as the lender leaked out to the press, much to Lehman's chagrin. He wasn't very happy about that. But thankfully, he accepted Gardner's sincere apology, and he even ended up recommending the Nelson-Atkins to his broader family and friends, including lawyer and financier Sam Lewison. Lewison sent 4 19th century French paintings to the Nelson, including Van Gogh's L'Arlésienne, which is also today in the Met. And just like Lehman, Lewison agreed to allow the painting to be displayed, but asked for anonymity. But this time, Gardner was fighting a losing battle. Lewison's Van Gogh was just too well known for the owner to remain a secret, and the Star even recognized the futility of Lewison's request when they wrote, quote, "In view of the fact that this is probably the most widely known Van Gogh in America, the evident desire of the owner to remain anonymous seems a trifle optimistic." True to form, however, the Star never uses Lewison's name. The first museum to send evacuated art to Kansas City was the Phillips Memorial Gallery in Washington, D.C. Today it's called the Phillips Collection. In January and February of 1942, director Duncan Phillips sent 40 paintings to Kansas City for safekeeping, including this famous Luncheon of the Boating Party by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. This was initially hung in a gallery by itself, because if you've ever seen it, it's really, really big. A lot of Phillips' paintings were, instead of being shunted to the storage galleries, were actually integrated into the Nelson-Atkins permanent galleries because they complemented the rest of the Nelson collection so well. In March of 1942, the director of the Yale University Art Gallery, Theodore Sizer Sr., had just deposited artworks from the Yale collection at the Nelson-Atkins, and he wrote to Duncan Phillips about their mutual situation. Quote, "When I left the pictures safely behind me, I breathed a sigh of relief. I returned more impressed than ever with the excellence of the Kansas City Museum. I never saw your pictures look so well. Of all places in the country, I believe this is the best for our dual purpose," end quote. Now, Sizer's sigh of relief was well earned, considering what he had to do to get 3 paintings by John Trumbull out of New Haven, Connecticut. Yale acquired these paintings from the artist in 1831 with some very unique stipulations. As Sizer explained to Gardner, according to the 1831 gift agreement, they could not be separated or lent, but must be kept intact with, curiously enough, the artist's body. Trumbull and his wife were buried on the Yale campus, and the gift agreement stipulated that any time the paintings moved, their bodies had to go with them. This had actually happened twice, in 1866 and 1928 during museum relocations. And indeed, the coffins did move with the paintings at those times. But Sizer recognized that there was no way that Mr. and Mrs. Trumbull were making the trip to Kansas City. And so he very successfully lobbied the Yale board to be able to bring them here to Kansas City. He actually hand-carried them all the way. The largest group of paintings sent to the Nelson-Atkins for safekeeping during the war was a group of 45 contemporary French works that had been on display at the Golden Gate International Exposition in San Francisco from 1939 to 1940. Once France was occupied by Nazi Germany in 1940, these paintings could not return to Europe, and thus they were stranded in the US. So the French Ministry of National Education assembled an exhibition, and the paintings had all been lent either by the artists themselves or by a gallery in Paris. Included Pierre Bonnard's Dining Room in the Country, which had been lent by the Galerie Bernheim Jeune, and today you can see it in the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Now, just as the monuments men and women had to coordinate the accumulation of all of the recovered works of art at the collecting points, someone here at the Nelson had to manage the logistics of bringing all of these refugee artworks into the museum. This became increasingly difficult as members of the museum staff were called into military service, and some of them also left for full-time volunteer service with groups like the Red Cross. In the first years of the war, the museum staff was decreased by 20 to 30%, and much of the day-to-day work was left to be done by a skeleton staff that consisted mostly of women. Director Paul Gardner's assistant, Etheline Jackson, who you see here on the left, took over as acting director of the museum when Gardner was sent to Italy. And Lawrence Sickman's assistant, Lindsay Hughes, took over as curator of Asian art when Sickman was called into service. These women and the remaining colleagues worked tirelessly to maintain a sense of normalcy at the museum during the war years, while simultaneously reacting to the increased demands that were inherent with wartime circumstances. Attendance dropped as gas rationing made it more difficult for people to get to the museum, and a lack of museum staff, unfortunately, required the cancellation of a number of children's programs. But despite the difficulties, the remaining staff did their best to carry on, and their efforts are outlined in the museum's annual report for 1942, which really sums up what they were trying to do in this period. Quote, "The value of cultural institutions is put to the test in such times of national stress, and their worth to the community is viewed in realistic terms. From this point of view, the above report is an encouraging one in spite of decreased attendance. The visiting public has been a more serious one, people who feel the need of cultural stimulation and who are willing to make the increased effort as necessitated by transportation difficulties and few leisure hours. A large proportion are men of the armed forces and newcomers to Kansas City, and their comments are invariably complimentary, not only to the gallery, but to the city which supports such an institution." Now, in an effort to serve as a safe haven, not only for art, but for the Kansas City public, the remaining Nelson-Atkins staff made a number of changes to the usual museum routine. They adjusted the museum's opening hours, in particular adding free Friday nights to better fit the availability of people who are working in the war sector. They also made space in the museum available for training courses, such as the Red Cross First Aid course and the Air Wardens training courses, which took place right here in this auditorium. They created a servicemen's lounge that gave a place for servicemen and women to have a quiet respite at the museum. They could enjoy cookies provided by the Art Study Club and coffee, which was paid for out of the installation of a new Coca-Cola machine. Exhibitions and rotations of works of art in the galleries continued and sometimes utilized the art that was evacuated from the coastal collections. And a lot of these focused on a wartime theme. Incredibly, the very morning of June 6, 1944, as news of the D-Day invasion came, the Nelson-Atkins staff came early to the museum and they assembled an exhibition of French landscapes that depicted scenes along the Normandy coast. And other towns that were likely to be in the Allies' path. They even included labels on the walls with text. The truly world record time for exhibition organization. I'm glad we have more than 3 or 4 hours today. Unfortunately, one consequence of having fewer staff members at the museum was that we have very few photographs of the galleries between the years of 1941 and 1945. We have no photographs that we know of any of the evacuated art that was stored here in the museum as it was on view in the galleries. And the exhibitions that came here, we have to get an understanding of from their associated catalogs, if there was one, or just from descriptions in the museum records. Most of these exhibitions that were organized outside the Nelson-Atkins were usually of art that had been stranded in the US, such as the French paintings from the Golden Gate Exposition, or they were made up of works of art that were light and small and would be easy to ship around, like works on paper or photographs. Here are just a couple of examples of wartime exhibitions: the British-American Goodwill exhibition, and war art, which included paintings that were done on the front lines by American artists on behalf of Life magazine. The staff also continued public programming, again with an aim often to further the war effort in some way. Lindsay Hughes, who was acting as curator of Asian art in Lawrence Sickman's stead, she put together a Chinese fair exhibition in what is today our sculpture hall. It's kind of hard to even recognize at this point. She gave a number of lectures on Chinese art in relation to this exhibition. She charged admission, and she was able to raise $350 for the Chinese War Orphans Fund. Now, as the war drew to a close, life at the Nelson-Atkins began to return to normal. All of the artworks that had been here for the duration were returned to their owners. Their lenders obviously expressed their gratitude through their correspondence, but Robert Lehman went a step further. He, in appreciation for the Nelson-Atkins assistance in safeguarding part of his collection, he donated 12 pieces of Italian maiolica and a painting by John Hopner to the museum collection in 1945. The museum staff, who had served in various capacities abroad, began to return as well, each with their own various stories of their experiences. Paul Gardner returned from Italy in the very first days of 1946, and I'm just beginning in my research to get an understanding of how war-weary he was. He clearly returned with a heavy heart. He was a World War I veteran who had been drafted into service this time around, even though he was 46 years old. And he really had not sought to go to war. He found himself at the front lines many times and had to witness the devastation firsthand. He had a lifelong love for Italy, and he worked for 3.5 years during World War II to literally pick up the pieces of this beloved country, and it took its toll on him. And very shortly after his return to Kansas City, he turned right around and went to his ranch in New Mexico for several weeks of just a quiet peace. Sickman, in contrast, seems to have jumped back into museum work with a renewed vigor upon his return in May of 1946. The return of the pre-war staff members meant that those who had stepped up and taken on leadership roles in the interim were, of course, required to step back once again. Gardner's assistant, Etheline Jackson, who had served as acting director in his absence, had overcome an initial skepticism about the abilities of a woman to handle that job. Under her tenure, the Nelson-Atkins successfully adapted to the challenges of the war years. They continued a tradition of quality exhibitions, programs, and they even made some acquisitions during a very difficult period in the museum's history. Her abilities were even recognized with her election as president of the Midwestern Museums Association in 1944. Shortly after Gardner's return, she resigned from the Nelson to marry Germain Seligman, who was a member of one of the most prestigious art dealing families in the world, and the couple moved to New York. Lindsay Hughes, who of course had served as acting curator of Asian art in Sickman's stead, had really greatly excelled in this new position. She gave at least 100 lectures during those years. She coordinated dozens of acquisitions, she published articles on Chinese art, and she even was able to secure several scholarships to further her academic training, including a very prestigious Chinese cultural scholarship that included a year of research at the University of Chicago. Similar to Jackson, Hughes resigned in 1946 to marry Frank Cooper, and the two of them moved to New York. And later, Hughes would become an associate at the prestigious art gallery of C.T. Liu, which focused on Asian art in New York. The Second World War presented a wide variety of challenges to the Nelson-Atkins, but also unique opportunities to contribute to the war effort at both home and abroad. The museum staff and their volunteers stepped forward to meet this challenge in a variety of ways. From the 6 men who served as monuments men in Europe and Asia, to the acceptance and preservation of evacuated art from collections on the coasts, to the museum staff's adaptation of exhibitions and facilities to meet the needs of the Kansas City public during the war. The Nelson-Atkins contributed in all of these ways to the preservation of global cultural heritage and served as a safe haven, not only for art, but also for the Kansas City public. One final note. A vast majority of this presentation is based on material in the Nelson-Atkins archives. These important records are invaluable resources, not only for the study of the history of the museum, but for the study of the history of Kansas City and for the history of the art market, especially during the 20th century. I'd like to invite you to visit an exhibition of World War II related archival material that has been put together by our archivist, Tara Laver. It's on view in the reading room of the Spencer Art Reference Library, which is on the upper floor of the Block building. It's not open tonight, but you can visit it at any time during regular library hours. If we have a couple of minutes, I'm happy to answer any questions if I can, and thank you so much for coming tonight.